video will introduce you to the concept of relevance, discuss the definition of relevance, and also discuss conditional relevance and application of Rule 403, which is where relevance is outweighed by another consideration like unfair prejudice. First, relevance. Federal Rule of Evidence 402 states that relevant evidence is admissible unless otherwise provided by the law, and importantly, irrelevant evidence is not admissible. The foundational requirement for the admission of any particular piece of evidence, whether in the form of testimony, documents, or otherwise, is that the evidence is relevant. Test for whether evidence is relevant is found in Rule 401. A two-part test. Evidence is relevant if, first, it has any tendency to make a fact more or less probable than it would be without the evidence. B, the fact is of consequence in determining the action. Importantly, you can never determine whether evidence is relevant just in the abstract. The question is always whether it's relevant to prove a particular fact. So it's a relationship between an item of evidence and something sought to be proved. Also important is that being relevant doesn't necessarily mean conclusive. Students often think, well, that evidence doesn't necessarily prove the defendant is guilty, for example, but the standard is actually much lower. Does the evidence have any tendency to make his guilt more or less probable than it would be without the evidence? Each piece of evidence is merely a brick in the wall of proof. So let's discuss the two parts of the definition of relevance in Rule 402. First is logical relevance or probative value. As a matter of logic and general experience, does this piece of evidence help convince you that something is more or less probable? So it's determined on the basis of logic and general experience and common sense. Don't overthink this one. If a defendant is accused of murder, for example, and was having an affair with the victim, that would help prove motive. It doesn't necessarily mean that he did it because he was having an affair with the victim, but it does make his guilt more probable. It's a matter of general experience of the jurors. Second is materiality. The fact that the evidence helping to prove must actually matter in the case, must be of consequence to the determination of the action. This is going to be a question of the substantive law involved in the case. For example, in a simple car wreck involving negligence, the fact that the defendant is a rich man is not relevant to the issues in the case. But if it's a case where the plaintiff is seeking punitive damages, then the defendant's wealth is relevant because the law allows you to look at that fact in deciding the amount of punitive damages. The fact that is material in the case doesn't have to be an ultimate fact, going to whether the defendant is liable, for example. It may be an evidentiary fact. It could go to a witness's credibility, for example, whether that witness should be believed. The fact may merely be a link in the chain of proof that the party is seeking to prove. Next, let's discuss conditional relevance. Sometimes a piece of evidence is only relevant if another fact is true. Under Rule 104B, if relevance depends on another fact, then proof must be introduced sufficient to support a finding that that other fact does exist. For example, if the prosecutor wants to show that the defendant had a motive to kill his wife because the wife was going to tell her son that his father was actually another man, then that fact is only relevant to the defendant's motive if he knew that she planned to tell her son the truth. The question is whether there's enough evidence produced that a jury could find that fact has been fulfilled by a preponderance of the evidence. Is there enough evidence that a jury could find the defendant knew his wife planned to tell her son he was not the father? If that condition is shown by a preponderance of the evidence, which is a simple majority, then the evidence that she was in fact planning to tell her son is relevant to the defendant's motive. Conditional relevance often involves knowledge, just like in this example. We'll see later that other types of conditions are dealt with under 104A, which is a tougher standard. There, the judge must be convinced herself that the condition has been fulfilled. Here, the judge may disagree and think that the condition has not been fulfilled, but if there's enough evidence that a jury could find it, then he has to let the jury decide. One of the most important rules of evidence that we'll discuss is Rule 403. It comes up all the time. Under that rule, even if a piece of evidence is relevant, it may be excluded by the court if its probative value is substantially outweighed by a danger of another concern, usually unfair prejudice, but also considerations of confusing the issues, misleading the jury, delay, wasting time, needlessly presenting cumulative evidence. So whenever a Rule 403 issue is raised, you must do a balancing. On one side is the probative value of the evidence. Why did you find it was relevant under Rule 401? How important is the piece of evidence in proving that particular fact? Is it the only piece of evidence you have, or are there other alternative ways of proving that same thing? If the fact the evidence goes to prove is not disputed or is stipulated to, then its probative value will be low. Bear in mind, though, that just because something is not disputed, it doesn't mean it's not relevant. But how relevant it is, its probative value in a Rule 403 setting will be lower in the circumstance where it's not disputed. On the other side of the scale is the adverse consequence that we're afraid of if that particular evidence comes in. When the issue is unfair prejudice, you need to focus on that word unfair. What might the jury do with that evidence that would be unfair? For example, prosecution seeks to introduce gory photographs of a victim's body during the autopsy to show how the knife entered the body in such a way that it killed the victim. The defendant argues that the picture is unfairly prejudicial. When you balance the evidence under 403, first look at the probative value of that picture to show what the prosecutor is seeking to show. Is there alternative evidence of how the knife killed the victim? Is the defendant even disputing that the knife killed the victim? These factors can result in lower probative value. On the other side of the scale, is the picture likely to lead the jury to act with its emotions rather than its logic? Is it unduly inflammatory? Or is it just a clinical, less gory type picture? The most important things to know in applying Rule 403 are what to put on either side of this scale, how to balance the scale, what factors go into probative value and other considerations. And then also, how do you do that balance? Under the language of the rule, there's a presumption that relevant evidence comes in. Only if its probative value is substantially outweighed by a danger of unfair prejudice, confusing the issues, misleading the jury, etc., will the judge keep it out. This is important because later rules that we will learn apply that balancing test in other ways. Under the standard Rule 403, it's presumed that the evidence comes in, and only if this balancing is heavily on the right side, unfair prejudice or other considerations, will the evidence be kept out.